From a ghoulish Croatian prison camp to the creepiest Japanese temple you've never seen, here are 10 of the scariest abandoned places in the world. Number 10. Croatian Women's Prison Camp. Sveti Gregor was once a women's penitentiary camp in Croatia, but has since been completely forgotten. It is now an old and abandoned ruin on an uninhabited island. Back in the day, when Yugoslavia was still a place in the 1940s, the prison was used to hold opponents of the Communist Party. The island is about 2.6 square miles. The island is located in the Adriatic Sea, between the islands of Goliotok, Kirk, and Rab. On medieval maps, it used to be called Arta. Its current name translates as Saint Gregor. Before the penitentiary was built, there was a small village where people hunted deer. The village was quiet and peaceful. Then the land was a scary and terrified prison. And today, the atmosphere is more than a little creepy. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was not kind to those who didn't follow the rules. And between 1948 and 1953, it's hard to imagine the horrors that went on in this prison. It was actually the female prisoners who were forced to construct the buildings that would ultimately hold them. But the brutality didn't end at forced labor. According to historical records, the prisoners were treated horribly, degraded in every possible way, and even forced to beat one another in front of the guards for their entertainment. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Sveti Gregor closed in 1986 and was subsequently abandoned. The old buildings are still on the island today, but nobody lives there. Number 9. The abandoned nuclear plant. The Santa Maria de Garona nuclear power plant was inaugurated in 1970 and today is an ugly, abandoned ruin. The plant was inaugurated by the Spanish dictator, Francisco Franco, with the technology to build the power plant gained by the American company General Electric. At the time, Garona was the biggest nuclear power plant of its kind anywhere on the European continent. But back in the 1980s, Greenpeace began to protest the nuclear power plant, with protests spurred by the accident in Harrisburg in 1979. The campaign to close down the nuclear plant actually went on until just recently, when in 2012, a year after the disaster at Fukushima, the plant was finally closed down. Regulations for the active maintenance of the power plant make it necessary to carry out regular drills in case of a nuclear accident. The towns and the surrounding areas meet and plan evacuation points for this type of incident, and even have a decontamination protocol. Today, the plant is a scary ruin filled with old, rusting technology. The plant is closed to the public, but hasn't been disassembled, so the huge pieces of hardware are still there. You're not allowed to visit though, as the place is basically condemned and extremely dangerous. Number 8. Russian chemical plant. There's an abandoned Russian chemical plant that, according to Business Insider, could set off a catastrophic environmental disaster like the one that took place at Chernobyl. Rosprirodnadzor, Russia's environmental agency, monitors actions that may have a negative impact on the environment. The head of Russia's environmental safety agency, Svetlana Radianova, has said recently that the chemical plant is filled with mercury and unknown chemicals, and it has simply been left to rot in rural Siberia. It's called the Usoya Chemprum plant, and it once manufactured chlorine and other chemicals. The facility first opened in 1933 in the Irkutsk region. It covers an area of about 1,500 acres. The only reason the plant shut down is that it went bankrupt in 2017. Nearby the plant is a town with about 80,000 people in it, but nobody goes near the chemical factory. 1, because it's creepy and scary. 2, because the chemicals inside the plant, specifically the high levels of mercury, can damage a person's kidneys and their nervous system. These substances have even been known to cause tumors to grow in rats. Scientists are still investigating the possible links between pesticides and disease in people, with some studies indicating that high levels of exposure to certain pesticides may raise one's risk of cancers like leukemia. To sum things up, this is not the kind of abandoned place you want to be urban exploring. Number 7. The Essex County Isolation Hospital. The Essex County Isolation Hospital was crafted near the city of Newark. It was built with the purpose of caring for those afflicted by infectious diseases. There were already psychiatric hospitals and tuberculosis sanatoriums in the region, but there was nothing designed to isolate people who were highly infectious. The city of Newark purchased the land in 1896 and began to build various structures to house the ill patients, as well as buildings for the hospital staff, such as a theater and a laundry service. They built a little community, and seeing as this was back over 100 years ago, the hospital also had a few acres of farmland. Disaster struck in 1917 though, when a cold snap caused the heating and lighting to break, and 24 people died and 32 people got frostbite. By the middle of the 1920s, the hospital was no longer really needed, and so it was transformed into a general hospital instead of an isolation hospital. But then over time, the hospital became more and more crowded. New mental illness treatment facilities appeared, and eventually, the hospital was too outdated to even be useful. It closed its doors in 2007 and was left abandoned for the next 10 years, until 2017, demolition crews came in and began to knock parts of the hospital down. Though even today, some of the abandoned wings remain. Do you think the Essex County Isolation Hospital is haunted? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 6. Dinosaur World. Dinosaur World is one of the most bizarre and freaky abandoned places anywhere in Arkansas. It was a tourist attraction in the town of Beaver, covering 65 acres and including hundreds of giant sculptures of dinosaurs, prehistoric monsters, and of course, cavemen. It also boasted the largest mural of Noah's Ark anywhere in the world. When it closed in 2005, it was the largest dinosaur park on the planet. Its history goes back to 1967, when Emmett Sullivan crafted almost a dozen replicas of dinosaurs. Then in the 1970s, the park was sold and a 40-foot tall statue of King Kong was built. Throughout the years, more and more statues were built, and more people came to visit. But by the early 2000s, interesting dinosaurs had basically disappeared, and nobody cared about the park anymore. They were forced to close, and within just 1 year, the whole park was overgrown by nature. It really did look like something out of a lost prehistoric world. Nobody did anything to the place. It was just left alone, and in August of 2011, a fire ran through the park and destroyed the main building. Today, it's a creepy, half-burned ruin filled with bug-eyed dinosaur statues. Number 5. Pripyat Town. Pripyat Town in Ukraine is one of the scariest ghost towns anywhere in the world. It was left abandoned after the nuclear disaster at a nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The nuclear disaster happened on April 26, 1986, and every last citizen of Pripyat was forced to leave everything they owned behind and evacuate immediately, lest they turn into mutated monsters. About 30 people died in the explosion, and a few thousand died because of cancer from being exposed to the dangerous radiation. Pripyat itself was the closest town to the reactor, with a population of about 49,000 strong. It was built in the 1970s strictly to house the people working at Chernobyl. There are 15 schools, a huge hospital, 25 stores, a handful of gyms, and even cinemas and an amusement park. It was a luxury in the Soviet Union, but in just 3 short hours, it was a ghost town. The absence of humans have been excellent for wildlife though. In 1986, wildlife was not doing well in Chernobyl. There were too many people and farms. After everyone left, the deer and boar population returned, and despite the high radiation levels, they were not showing any obvious signs of mutations. Though apparently, the plants turned strange, with some reports that some were glowing. The animal populations grew enormously. Today, the animal populations more closely resemble that of a national park than a radioactive contaminant zone. As it turns out, animals prefer a nuclear disaster over normal human habitation. All these decades later, Pripyat is still abandoned and lifeless. The only way in is through a guided tour, and much of the place is still plagued by radiation. There are gas masks everywhere, broken dolls scattered throughout empty houses, and it wouldn't be much good for anything other than maybe the set of a horror movie. Number 4. Dorison Station. Dorison Station in South Korea is less than a mile from the boundary of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. It's a modern train station that was completed in 2002. For a brief time, freight trains traveled from the northern side of the border into Dorison. That was back when relations between North and South Korea were a little stronger. But then when tensions flared once more, the station was shut down and it has been abandoned ever since. Today, the station sits completely empty and unused, with signs inside the terminal pointing passengers to board trains in Pyongyang, trains that will never come. It was more a symbol of hope than anything, and the fact that it's abandoned today leaves a lot of people in both North and South Korea feeling pretty hopeless. The emptiness of the station itself makes the place scary, and it's a grim reminder of the division of the Korean peninsula and the violence that can erupt at any moment. This is not a place you want to be caught inside of, as it's way too close to the danger of the DMZ and the watchful North Korean soldiers. Number 3. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. There is nowhere quite as scary as an abandoned lunatic asylum, and the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum may just be the scariest. It was once a psychiatric hospital operated by the state of West Virginia. It was operational from between 1864 and 1994. It was designed in the beautiful Gothic Revival style by an architect from Baltimore. This makes the asylum just that much creepier. It was designed to hold 250 people at maximum, but like most of the institutions in America by the 1950s, it was horribly overburdened with at least 2,400 patients. Because of the overcrowding, there was a huge issue with sickness, people literally being locked inside of cages, and the state ordering a ridiculous number of lobotomies to reduce the patient population. They thought that if they could simply pull out pieces of people's brains, they could ship them back home and call them cured. In 1994, the asylum was forced to close. Ever since, the building and the large grounds which it sits upon have been abandoned. There have been occasional events, such as fairs and church gatherings. In 1999, there was significant damage when the county police officers decided to play a game of paintball inside. Now, it's an abandoned museum where you can go on a tour and look for the ghosts of the mentally deranged. Are you brave enough to go? Number 2. Mandu, Ancient City. In India, Mandu is an abandoned ruin that will give you nightmares. It comes from the Mughal area and has been abandoned and in disrepair for at least 400 years, according to the Huffington Post. Back when India was a Muslim nation, Mandu was the capital. It was a bustling fortress town, filled with tombs, palaces, mosques, and impressive monuments. Today, though, it's a little freaky. The Hoshang tomb is the oldest marble building in all of India, while the Rupmati Pavilion overlooks a cliff with a sheer drop 1,000 feet to the deadly rocks below. This is an abandoned oasis that almost no one visits, and for good reason. It's often covered in an eerie fog. Some say it's filled with ghosts, and the atmosphere is so ghoulish that most of the locals avoid the place at all costs, as if it's the ruin of some evil necromancer's palace. And number 1, the Sogenji Temple. The Sogenji Temple in Japan is one of the creepiest abandoned places ever. The temple has a shrine to Japanese water goblins, known as kappa. In Japanese folklore, these aquatic goblins are known for kidnapping children when they walk over bridges and pulling them down into the muck below. The kappa is a turtle-like monster with a bowl on its head that it must keep filled with water in order to stay alive. There are all kinds of weird myths surrounding these goblins, and the Sogenji Temple in Tokyo is where they've been immortalized in tons of little statues. The temple was built in the 17th century and abandoned sometime after that. Historians aren't exactly sure when, but even though the weird temple is abandoned, some people continue to show up and leave behind offerings of cucumbers, which is the kappa's favorite food. There's a treasure chamber hidden inside the temple, which contains drawings of little goblins on old scrolls, and even what legend says is the mummified arm of a real, physical kappa monster. Thanks for watching. Would you dare visit any of these creepy places? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more. See you next time.